Yeah, bears die. This bear starved to death. It's an old bear. It starved to death in spring during a period of maximum ice coverage. It wasn't due to climate change at all. It lost its life at a time when the ice coverage was the strongest in that particular area, which was Davis Strait. There's about 24,500 polar bears in the circumpolar basin. But survival estimates, we know that about 1,500 die a year because of natural mortality. Observing natural mortality is not evidence or proof that the population is declining or going extinct. Death is as common as birth in natural populations. Another bit of evidence that come out is that polar bears, because now they're at the time on shore is longer and they're in closer proximity, there's more cannibalism. What you're seeing here, the bear in the background, is a large adult male and attacked and killed the cub. And if you can see, it's consumed part of the cub. But if you look carefully, like neither the cub, which is a yearling cub, or the adult male is in poor condition. You can't see the female. She's lying on a hill overlooking the scene. I tagged her too. I immobilized her. The male isn't dead, by the way. It's just immobilized. So essentially, all three bears were in good condition. Again, intra-specific attacks occur. The local people, hunters, report this as common in all polar bear populations. You could use something like this to argue that polar bears are evolving into kind of a hell bear so that they can feed exclusively on man, or that this bear was so nutritionally stressed that it ate its own nose. I mean, it probably lost its nose in a trap as a cub, right? But these anecdotal sort of things that you see in the press all the time, they prove nothing. The demographic perspectives that we develop are not based on conjecture or climate models. They're based on data. It's science. These data have identified two populations that are currently in trouble. Neither population appears to be viable. By that I mean that it would decline even if there was no harvest at the present time. And the survival rates to decline to the point where, the increase in natural mortality coupled with a harvest that's no longer sustained has caused that population to decline. They weren't able to identify a numerical decline in the Southern Beaufort Sea, but they were able to show that life history parameters, rates of birth and death, are no longer sufficient for that population to increase. Most of the literature, most of the proof, most of what's written about the circumpolar situation comes from these two populations. There are two others that are also declining. That's in the Polar Bear Specialist Group report. Kane Basin and Baffin Bay. Both are declining because they're overhunted. It has nothing to do with climate change. It's a demographic result. So we have two that are declining, probably from climate change, two that are declining from overhunting. The guys who give us an argument about Baffin Bay, the hunters, they don't feel that it's declining. From our data, science, we think that the bears are probably being reduced in that area. But both those populations are viable. Both could sustain the harvest if it was just reduced to sustainable limits. This table, and I've got a sort of a website that you can get all of this in sort of more explained form, is essentially the information that we draw on to develop a demographic perspective on status. You can see there are only two boxes that are highlighted, Western Hudson Bay and Southern Beaufort Sea, where the populations are non-viable. We don't have time to go sort of in through the table and talk about the different cells and population growth rates, but we're using population viability analysis, data-based population projections. Most of the populations, which data have been collected over the past 20 years during the reduction in ice, during the time when the climate has gotten generally warmer, most of these populations have been not, if they have had a reduction in their productivity and their ability to sustain a harvest, what remained was still sufficient that we could have a fairly substantial harvest, in fact a harvest at approximately historical levels. So that perspective has been criticized, and that's how it used to be. That people say now it's different. Now we've had climate change, and now some of these populations are, declining. And just because you haven't seen it in the older work doesn't mean it's not happening now. That's a valid point. So let's look just at 6 studies that have been completed since 2004. I mentioned the top 2 already: the Southern Beaufort and the Western Hudson population. It looks like those populations are in decline. The Northern Beaufort and Southern Hudson populations, which are adjacent to those two, appear to be constant again from the same kind of market capture studies I've shown. And the Davis Strait and Barents Sea populations appear to have increased. And again, just to show on the map, the Davis Strait and Barents Strait populations have increased from historical levels. Current trend is unknown. We're just completing a study in Davis Strait. And the Barents Sea was done by aerial surveys, so we won't have the birth and death rates we need to sort of project a trend from those populations. But at least from the last 20 years, an increase for Barents Strait, Davis Strait, decline for southern Gulf and western Hudson, and no change for northern Gulf and southern Hudson. Now this is not a scenario where the bears are declining to extinction. So where's that coming from? Well, it's coming, as Scott stated earlier, it's coming entirely from the climate change models that say the ice will continue to deteriorate, and that the things we've seen in southern Gulf and western Hudson will occur in these other populations. Well, let's examine that. And again, these are not from my work. These are from a paper by Dr. Steve Amsterdam with USGS. He's identified 4 types of ice and said that the way the ice will decline won't be the same in all areas, which is true. He's got divergent ice, where prevailing winds and currents move it out of the area. Convergent ice, which benefit from that by receiving the ice that's pushed around. Seasonal populations, which have always had an open water season, and archipelago populations, which basically have summer sea ice every year. And if you take the climate models, which they have done, and you project forward what will happen to sea ice from 2004, which is the Polar Bear Specialist Group's status report where we get our population estimates from. So 2004 is the baseline for these 4. Let's see, the new PowerPoint's messed up the top. But for the 4 archipelago seasonal divergent and convergent ice, you'll see, and if you just look at the all column, you'll see that about in 100 years, we're looking at a reduction of the ice that's greater than 50% over continental shelf waters, that the reduction will be about 32%. And if we apply that, as Amsterdam suggests is reasonable, on a one-on-one basis to the number of polar bears, we'd expect to see a reduction in the total populations from about 24,500 down to about 17,180 over the next 100 years. Over the next 40 years, we would only expect to see a reduction to, say, 2,405, which looks like about, what would that be, about an 18% reduction. It's a bit easier to see on the graph, but yes, if the climate change models are right, we're going to see a decline in sea ice. That's what these graphs are saying. And if we have the decline in sea ice, you might notice on this one it doesn't go to 0, it just goes to 0.6. If you notice on the other one, which does go to 0, then it could be expected to reduce the populations, but not cause them to go extinct or even be eliminated from a large part of their range, but simply to cause a decline of about 30% over a 100-year time frame. Given all the uncertainty about climate change model projections, and given the fact that most populations are stationary or increasing as far as we know from the science that's been done, it's hard for me to understand why people think polar bears are going extinct. It would have some economic impacts. U.S. sport hunters couldn't bring trophies back. That brings about somewhere between $1.5 million and $2.5 million of revenue into our traditional economy in the north, and it goes right into the hands of the people who need it the most. So the other thing too, I guess, that I would say in terms of impacts to local people is the perspective that polar bears are in trouble is entirely not shared by local hunters. There's an article coming out in Arctic titled "Time with the Most Bears" that was done by a social scientist who just interviewed people, and what the consensus opinion across the north is there's never been a time when there's been more polar bears, probably because of the management things we've done to control the harvest. So